When you picture Joseph Stalin, you probably see this iron-fisted ideologue, a man totally driven by a single-minded belief in global revolution. But the source material for this explainer, well, it paints a much more complicated picture of his early foreign policy. It really asks us to chew on a puzzle. Was he a true believer, ready to set the world on fire for the cause? Or was he a cold, calculating realist, just playing the long game for Soviet survival? Let's dive in and unpack the high-stakes choices he made to figure this out.
So this is the big question we're tackling, right? And the essay we're drawing from argues that the answer isn't some simple either-or. In fact, it suggests that getting a handle on this duality is the key to understanding not just Stalin, but the very nature of authoritarian power and maybe even the origins of the Cold War itself. It reveals a leader who's way more complex than the simple caricature we usually get.
So, inside the Communist Party, there were two powerful ideas, almost like metaphors at war with each other. Trotsky and the party's left wing, they were all about the wildfire. This was the classic Marxist idea of permanent revolution, spreading communism across the globe like, well, a wildfire. But Stalin, nope. He rejected that. He chose the fortress. He argued for socialism in one country, a strategy all about building the USSR into an industrial powerhouse first, one that could defend itself against anyone.
And honestly, when you put yourself in his shoes and look at the map, you kind of start to get the paranoia. The Soviet Union was surrounded. Its huge border wasn't just a line on a map. It was a ring of fire. You had an absolutely chaotic civil war in China, an expansionist Japan breathing down his neck, the rise of fascists in Italy and Germany, and, of course, a deeply suspicious Britain and France. This was not a friendly neighborhood by any stretch of the imagination. So, facing all this pressure, Stalin makes a monumental choice. And this choice, which we know as the Great Turn, wasn't just about foreign policy. Oh no, it was a radical domestic shift that would end up being the foundation for every single decision he made on the world stage.
The Great Turn was basically Stalin's all-in bet on his fortress model. Kicking off in 1928, he launched this brutal, lightning-fast campaign to industrialize the nation and force peasants onto collective farms. The goal? It was singular: make the Soviet Union strong, self-sufficient, and totally secure. For Stalin, exporting the revolution was a luxury he just couldn't afford. Survival had to come first.
And this quote, wow, it just captures the sheer desperation that was driving him. In 1931, he basically said they had just 10 years to catch up with the advanced countries or they would be crushed. And here's the really eerie part. The Great Patriotic War, Germany's invasion of the USSR, it began almost exactly 10 years later, in 1941. His fears, it turned out, were very real.
Okay, so with this fortress policy now locked in, how did it actually play out in the real world? Well, the first big test came in China, a massive, unstable neighbor that presented Stalin with a huge dilemma.
On one side, you had the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. That seems like the obvious, ideologically pure choice, right? Well, not so fast. Stalin was suspicious. Their revolution was being led by peasants, and traditional Marxist theory said the revolution had to be led by industrial workers in the cities. Then, on the other side, you had the nationalists, the GMD. Supporting them was, well, it was pragmatic. It could stabilize his border and let him focus on the Great Turn back home. Stalin chose pragmatism. He backed the nationalists, and the cost of that choice was, as the source essay calls it, eye-watering. The GMD set up a military dictatorship, and then in 1927, they turned on their supposed allies and slaughtered 30,000 striking communist workers. For a Marxist, this was the ultimate betrayal, siding with violent oppressors against the very working class you claim to champion. But this pattern of sacrificing ideology for stability wasn't just a one-off. If he was willing to do it in China, what do you think he'd do in Germany? The very country that Karl Marx himself believed was the perfect place for a world-changing revolution? He made a deal. The Treaty of Berlin was another clear win for pragmatism over revolutionary fire. Instead of trying to spark a communist uprising in Germany's industrial heartland, Stalin signed a pact with Germany's capitalist, democratic government to normalize relations, and, this is crucial, to trade with them. And if you look at the terms of the treaty, his whole strategy is laid bare.
Article 2 promised neutrality, which secured his western border. Smart. Article 3 prevented economic boycotts, which secured the trade and technology he desperately needed for his great turn. This treaty gave Stalin the breathing space he was craving. He basically recognized that the revolution had failed in Germany for now, so he pivoted to do what was best for the USSR.
So the pattern seems pretty clear, doesn't it? Stalin was a pure pragmatist. He sacrificed communists for security in China and in Germany. But just when you think you've got this picture in focus, the story takes this sharp, and I mean deeply ideological turn. Suddenly, he declared war on a new enemy, the social fascists. Now, who are these guys? This was his label for Europe's social democrats, the moderate left-leaning parties. In Stalin's mind, these groups were even more dangerous than capitalists because they offered just enough compromise to prevent a real workers' revolution from ever happening.
His logic, which came straight from Lenin, was that capitalism was on the verge of total collapse. He truly believed the Social Democrats were the only thing propping it up with their mild little reforms. So, the Comintern, the International Communist Organization, was ordered to attack them as the #1 enemy. And tragically, this meant that in places like Germany, communists were busy fighting other leftists instead of uniting against the actual rising threat of Nazism. So, how in the world do we square this circle? We have a ruthless pragmatist in China and Germany, but then a hardline ideologue in the Comintern. The essay argues that the final verdict is that Stalin wasn't purely one or the other. He was something way more complex.
He was a complex hybrid. The two things weren't separate for him. They were deeply tangled up together. He used his grand ideology of socialism in one country to justify these intensely pragmatic moves for state survival. And at the same time, he pushed these hardline ideological goals when he thought the global conditions were right for a revolutionary push. And this brings us to the crucial point of the whole analysis. This wasn't even new. He was following right in the footsteps of his predecessor, Lenin. Lenin himself had rolled out the new economic policy, which was a temporary one step back towards capitalism, just to save the revolution. Stalin's deal with Germany? It was the exact same kind of move, a pragmatic compromise in service of a larger ideological goal. He was, in a very real sense, Lenin's pragmatic heir. So this leaves us with a final, really challenging question. Was this blend of ideology and realpolitik a brilliant, necessary strategy for the survival of the world's first communist state in an incredibly hostile world? Or was it the ultimate betrayal of the global revolution that Marxism had always promised? That's the complex legacy we are left to untangle.